Good morning and welcome to the Point. Being a freshman legislator and being a freshman legislator in the minority is not necessarily the best place from which to legislate if you're in Lansing. But that hasn't stopped Kalamazoo's Jon Hoadley. He's a freshman Democrat who tells us what his first few months in office have been like. Representative, it's been 6 months or so since you first took office. You and I talked when you were running for office. We talked shortly after you took office, and now you've had a half a year to kind of get acclimated. Give me your sense of what it's like, not just here in Lansing, but overall, being a state representative versus what you thought it might be like when you decided to run for office.
Well, there's definitely more good days than bad days. It's been such a joy to get to serve people in Kalamazoo. I mean, the best part about the job is getting to learn something new every day. And so for me, that's fantastic. You know, one of the things, though, that's maybe unexpected about how this has turned out is the degree to which sort of you have to change your pace in the legislature. So, you know, I talk about two things. One is, you know, sometimes you'll get done with taking a really tough vote and you're frustrated. And, you know, then 30 seconds later, we're all standing up together, bipartisanly, to applaud someone truly heroic or some amazing accomplishment. And you have to get your mindset in the right spot. The second thing, though, is how oftentimes little compromise ends up happening. A lot of people think that we pass laws in the legislature like you do on Schoolhouse Rock. And that's just not how the case works here. If they don't have the votes, then oftentimes the bill won't even come up for discussion. And that's why you rarely see, and I don't think we've seen any so far this year, where the bill has failed once it's gone up for a vote. And you know, at the end of the day, it makes it hard to compromise. And it also explains why we see things like the road funding conversation, where we haven't taken some votes for a solution because the votes aren't there.
Let's talk about that a little bit more in depth, because I'm not sure people just hearing that quite understand. For example, roads, and we're going to talk about roads specifically, but I'm going to use that as an example here, because even as we sit here in Lansing, this will air on Sunday, but as we talk, there was a session day today. It lasted a few seconds from gavel in to gavel out. There was no vote. It was posted as no roll call, no votes will be taken. Though people are still talking, there's some optimism on the part of some that some kind of a deal can be hammered out. But what's actually happening is all of these discussions, largely among Republicans, because Republicans need to put up their part of the votes. I don't know.
Only among Republicans currently.
And so to get to 56, they're trying to find a package that they can agree on and vote on maybe later in August. I think it's more likely September, but no matter when it is. And so instead of doing this on the floor, as you might have seen, and I'll use your example as Schoolhouse Rock, that's not what happens here.
That's right. And so I think a lot of constituents aren't aware that by the time we're actually voting for things on the floor, it's largely been determined that the affirmative side, the yes votes, have 56 or enough to get the bill passed. And so, you know, this idea that we're going to all come to the floor and we're going to debate the merits or weaknesses of a particular issue, that's not how it occurs. And they happen oftentimes in caucus. And the rules is that first, folks try to find the votes within their own political party, and then they start reaching across the aisle. And what's happened, and I think road funding is a great example, where there are some folks in the Republican caucus that support, you know, finding new revenue to pay for roads. Other folks have taken pledges that says they'll never raise taxes. And that makes them unable to contemplate how they're going to find new money to pay for roads. But as a result, they can't get 56 votes within their caucus, which prevents then the issue from coming to the floor. And they haven't reached across yet to the Democratic side of the aisle to say, what are some ways that we could work together to get the votes we need to pass a complete package? And until that happens, you know, we're going to be stuck with potholes in our roads.
We're going to come back to the roads conversation in just a little bit, but I want to stay on the procedural here a little bit. You said something a minute ago, and I'm interested in how this works, because you say you take a vote and you're frustrated, and being in the minority, I assume, as often as not, you're going to take a vote that is going to be the opposite of what the outcome is, and so that can be frustrating. But then you said we all stand up together, talking about your 109 other colleagues, and salute a hero or salute somebody that is visiting, or maybe pass a resolution that is unanimous. What effect does this process have on your ability to create friendships, create maybe not even friendships, but a working relationship with people on the other side of the aisle, because again, it's going to take some cooperation for a lot of these things. So how do you feel that process works here in Lansing?
Sometimes it's difficult. I'm really glad to say that I've made friends across the aisle. There's some really good folks that I've got to know personally, and we're not going to agree on a lot of policy issues. And sometimes we're going to have to say things to make sure that we're sharing our values with the world so they see the differences in our approach to solving problems. But generally, I don't think people are bad. And you can always find a way to come over with a handshake. And one thing that I typically do is I like to bake, and so oftentimes I'll bring cookies. And there's nothing that sort of mends some friendships like offering a good cookie. But at the same time, too, that can be really hard. When we had the debate on the license to discriminate in adoption bills, in foster care bills, bills that now allow us to use taxpayer-funded dollars to discriminate against LGBT families. For me, that was really personal, and it was hurtful. And I respect that some folks felt like they had to vote for those bills because of their constituents, or maybe because of their personal beliefs. And that's hard, right? And so when they come over and they want to shake your hand afterwards, you have to realize that you hope that this is a long process. And again, there's a human element to it that makes it surprising and I think difficult sometimes in the legislature. But part of being in public service is you have to figure out how do you elevate the needs of your constituencies, the need of the state over your individual beliefs or individual feelings sometimes. And so that's the constant balance that a lot of us are always struggling with. And the truth is that some days you need to take a little break, you need to go for a walk, but at the end of the day you remember that you took an oath to uphold the state constitution and uphold our U.S. Constitution. And that's what you got to keep coming back to.
Let's talk about that a little bit. This has been a consequential time with the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage, with the governor asking for the expansion of the Elliott Larson protection for the LGBT community, something that, as an observer, I say looks unlikely, at least at this point. I know your current colleague and your chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party is talking about a ballot initiative. Where are we on that process here in the legislature? Is that something that is likely to come up?
I'm hopeful that there is still a conversation that we can have about updating the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in this legislative session. I don't think we're going to see it right away, but I also know that this is an issue that's not going away. When you start talking especially to younger folks, the idea that we would treat our LGBT friends and neighbors differently than you treat a straight ally is just absurd. And so finding a way to just make sure that we're treating everybody fairly and equally in our state laws is going to be an issue that doesn't go away. I hope that over the next year or so that we can find a way to bring it up in the legislative conversation. It would be great to see us handle it legislatively instead of having to go to the ballot. And but I think people are going to keep options open right now because the truth is 70% plus of folks in Michigan want to make sure that we're not discriminating against gay and lesbian or bisexual and transgender folks. And if the legislature isn't responsive to that needs, it's really a symptom that the political process isn't working the way it should.
70%, there's the number you just used. Where, based on polling, based on?
Consistent polling that's happened time and time again shows that this is an issue that's overwhelmingly popular with Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And that shows up in poll after poll.
It's interesting then, if it's 70%, that it would follow that the majority of folks because you were talking about constituencies, the majority of folks in most districts then would be in favor of this. Do you see constituents rallying around this issue and pushing this in the legislature? Is that one of the reasons you hope you can still get to it?
Yeah, we see people talking about Elliott Larson updating all the time. I mean, a lot. When you look at the number of signatures at myequalitynow.com, the folks that have become citizen co-sponsors of my bill that would update the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. It's incredible that people are talking about it. It's in the news. People are ready for this. But again, it's one of those issues where there's an outpouring of support. There are people who are actively asking for us to do this, but the legislature isn't taking it up. And that I think is really reflective of this idea that the current political system isn't working as well as it should. And I talk about this a lot. Oftentimes it's the result of very high campaign finance limits that require special interest dollars. It's very short-term limits that give more power to lobbyists than it does to elected officials. And ultimately, it's about these districts that are drawn in a way to benefit incumbents over anything else. And that means that we're not being responsive to the constituencies out in the state of Michigan.
And I know you also have ideas about that we want to get to, but I want to talk to you for just a moment about the idea that it is so difficult to get things done. And you alluded to special interest. I am always interested in what you think a special interest is, because generally it's somebody who is providing campaign financing to somebody with whom you don't agree. Because everybody has a special interest of some sort. How do you define that?
I mean, special interests are the groups that are using significant political contributions to influence the political process. And I don't think that's always bad, right? I'm going to say that I think sometimes lobbyists can be really helpful in providing information. And, I know that regular working folks, right? We don't have time to come up to Lansing every single day to tell us what we're thinking about every single bill. And so there's a value about being in part of membership organizations that can express your issues and values on particular pieces of legislation. But I do know that oftentimes there are sets of special interests that are giving so much money to the political process that they're driving what does and doesn't make it on the agenda. And I think that we have to be really careful about that, because ultimately, even when there are really good ideas, if there's oftentimes enough money in the system to prevent those ideas from coming to light, then they go nowhere.
We're back with another one of Representative Hoadley's initiatives next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Kalamazoo's Jon Hoadley is a state representative, a freshman, a Democrat, in the minority, but he still thinks there are big things that need to happen, and he thinks he can do just that. One of those would change the way we do redistricting in the state. Let's talk about another issue that you are interested in that would address some of what you mentioned earlier, and that is looking at a different way to draw boundaries, to draw districts. The way it works now, and you correct me if my explanation is wrong, essentially it becomes a function of the legislature. The legislature is controlled by one party or the other, and after that, every decade we have a census. After that, the districts are redrawn generally along that party's prerogative. Sometimes they're challenged in court, but for the most part, the party in power gets to draw them. And in the most recent census, and districts have been drawn by Republicans. Is that more or less how that works?
Well, that's currently accurate, yes.
And so you think there's a better way. How would you do it?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of states that think there's a better way. And in fact, the 1963 Michigan Constitution thought there was a better way too as well. Ultimately, many states are moving to what's called nonpartisan redistricting commissions or independent commissions. And the goal of those commissions are to say, the folks that are going to benefit from the lines drawn shouldn't be the ones drawing the lines. A lot of folks might be familiar with, you don't let the fox guard the hen house, right? And what I would argue is that we should create a nonpartisan commission that's made up of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So we acknowledge that there's going to be partisan interests. And then we say they have a job to draw lines that have equal population size districts, that respect municipal and geographic boundaries, that are compliant with the Voting Rights Act and our Constitution, and then ultimately are done so in a way that requires some sort of political consensus to actually draw the lines. The plan that I'm supporting would make a commission of 14 folks, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. And for a map to be drawn, 3 from each of those groups would have to agree. So 9 people would have to vote on the maps. And the result of this is that that you have to build some sort of consensus to get the lines drawn. And then we're not asking legislators, who are oftentimes looking out for their next election, to approve those maps.
The idea, and I know that this has been talked about by other members who have served and are now out of office, and others who think that there is a better way to do it. One of the questions that always comes up is, then where do you find those people?
Sure.
How do you certify, if you will, that this person are Democrats, these people are Republicans, not just people who say that, and where do you come up with that group of people?
Great question. So I'm actually, the version of the bill that I've introduced in the constitutional amendment are a reintroduction of Sean McCann's plan from the 97th legislature. And ultimately it handles this by doing what's called a double arm's length transaction. So 3 folks are appointed, and because the folks who are going to do a set of the appointing involve partisan political offices, that they're going to know the folks that are on their own team, and each one are going to have the ability to check on their own team members. The second thing is that for the independents, we do so by excluding folks who have direct family connections, immediate family connections, significant political contributions, maybe they've served in a partisan office. So that's made from a selection of folks that would then be disqualified because of prior political activity. And then what happens is that some set of folks anyone can apply. They're going to a pool. Some set of folks are selected, so it gets down to 20 from each of those groups. Then the partisan folks get to strike people from each one of those. So you get to look at who's on the other team's members, and if you know there's someone that you want to make sure isn't in the process, you can strike them. And each one gets a couple of those. And then ultimately, a set of folks pick the first 5 people from each of those groups, and then they draw randomly the rest. So there's both an element of selection and randomness involved in the process from a qualified pool of people. This ensures then that no one can really rig the system to be an advantage to them. And remember, because you have to have 3 people from each group agree on the plans, it really does require consensus.
And what happens if they don't? So let's just give you a scenario that the independents and the Republicans say, we like this, and the Democrats say, wait a minute, this is not representative, this is not what we want. And then what happens?
It's in the process, it's charged that they have to do this. They have a constitutional obligation, and they'll be swearing an oath to do so. I mean, at some level, we have to have people who agree to get the job done. And if they fail to uphold those duties, then a new group would have to be selected.
It's an interesting concept because there are some other things, and I think you alluded to it. I mean, there are some districts that have other requirements of having populations within those districts represented. So it's not just as simple as drawing box-like lines and trying to keep the districts looking more standardized than they do now. Because if you look at a district map now, there's some. The old,
there's everything. There's crosses. Yeah. There's spirals.
Yeah, the old Gary Peters House District was one of those examples that kind of turned around, and it was a small district, but it could take you 45 minutes to drive from end to end because of the way it was drawn. But there are other stipulations, so you'd have to deal with that too.
Right. And ultimately, I think that the plan that myself, Representative Moss, and other folks have introduced so far is a starting place. It's a Democratic plan that says we think that there should be a nonpartisan redistricting commission that draws these lines. I imagine my Republican colleagues might want to introduce something, or a nonpartisan group that wants us completely out of the process altogether. But the important thing is that we're having the conversation. And with the recent Supreme Court ruling that upheld that citizens can be empowered in initiative states like Michigan to draw the lines, this is coming front and center. And the thing that I just keep coming back to is that so many people I talk to think that the system isn't working. And they're not quite sure why it's not working, but they're getting the sense that it's not responsive, or that they know the end of the game before it's even been played. And to me, that's really a symptom that we have to be tackling these structural reforms. Whether that's looking at the campaign finance limits, having an honest conversation about term limits, or creating independent redistricting commissions that can help fairly draw the lines.
Talk about term limits. That's the second time you've mentioned it. And as one who has covered this legislature without term limits, and others where there were no term limits, and covering this with term limits, there is a considerable difference. When you mention term limits, what is your concern about the 6 years that you can spend in the House, for example?
So the major concern that I have with term limits, and I've heard from so many people, is that they're so short that by the time you learn to do the job well for your constituents, that you're already looking for your next job or your next election. And that does a disservice to folks. Do you know that when we started our orientation, they brought in lobbyists, and one of the things they told us was, because of term limits, you should always be polite because they're going to be here long after you will. I mean, that's one of the things that just really stuck with me. And I think when folks thought we should have term limits in the state of Michigan, no one thought that they were voting to give more power to lobbyists than they were to their own elected officials. I was really proud to co-sponsor 2 versions of constitutional amendments that would work to change that from Representative Ed McBroom, Republican from up north. And one option would then eliminate term limits, and one would create a pool of 16 years. So then you could say you have 16 years, you can spend them all in the Senate or House or some combination. But it gives you a little bit more flexibility in figuring out the best way to serve your constituents.
When you look at term limits, when you look at what it does, is it disqualifies people on a 6-year basis from ever running for that office again. So I remember the first year that term limits kicked in, anybody in a particular district could have run except for the person who had served, which seemed a little odd. Now, we've gone through this incarnation several times. As a realist, when you look out over the landscape, when you understand how people feel about government in general, we hearken back to the May vote on Proposal 1, which was not, I would suggest, just a repudiation of Proposal 1, but perhaps of the way they look at government and what is or is not happening. How realistic is it that you could ever undo term limits in the state?
I mean, I think it's an important conversation to have, and I think it is a possibility. Because the other thing I'm seeing right now is that we're in a moment of political change. And this happens, once every 20, 30, 40 years or so. And we're in this moment of an election where the process really matters. And whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, a progressive, or conservative, I think people are under this sense that the system isn't working and they're really hungry for some change. The other thing that I'm noticing, though, is that when people say that Proposal 1 was a repudiation of the whole system, I can't disagree with that. But it also then says to me, when you find someone that you like, that feels like they're really doing a good job for you, then what can we do to not automatically disqualify them from further serving the people of their district?
We didn't fully examine the idea of roads, partially because as a reporter I'm growing a little weary of talking about it, but we did at least touch on it. One of the things that you said is that right now Republicans are only talking with Republicans. Is it your sense, and this is a guess because I'm sure that you're not privy to their caucuses, but is it your sense that they can come up with a 56-vote plan that will satisfy what the Senate has done or something comparable to that? Or are Democrats at some point going to have to be brought into the mix?
Well, I don't know if there's an easy way to answer this question. And I'll tell you that I get in trouble all the time because I tell the truth. And the truth is we don't have enough money to pay to fix roads. And the problem with all the current plans right now is that they don't adequately find enough new money to pay for the roads that people in Michigan want and deserve. And both the House plan and the Senate plan and that the Republicans passed right now do so by cutting future dollars, or cutting dollars in the current program, or relying on future dollars that we have no idea if they'll be there. So anyone who's serious about having an adult conversation about how do we pay for roads, they look at those plans and they say, this isn't something that we could hire new workers for or plan to fix our roads on. So the question of sort of, do they have the votes in the Republican caucus to do that? I mean, my gut says no, because many of them have signed pledges that say they'll never raise taxes. And ultimately, then there isn't enough money to do what people want to do. One of the things that we're having on the Democratic side of the conversation is saying, listen, we're realists. There's got to be new money to pay for these roads. The question is, who's going to be picking up the tab? And if you've had a sense that maybe over the last few years that middle class or working class folks have been picking up the tab more often than not, while we've been giving literally, billions of dollars in business tax cuts, then the question is, are we going to have working and middle class people pay for this too? So I think that's where some of the controversy is happening right now, and it's created this situation where we can't come together to really talk about how much money does the state of Michigan need to pay for the services people want.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. The legislature is still grappling with what to do about roads. We're watching that, and of course keeping an eye on the presidential sweepstakes. Next Sunday, Governor John Kasich is one of our guests. To the Point.